Hello and welcome to our third chapter of this course. So this is going to be chapter 11 and we're going to talk about motivation and emotion. It's actually one of my favorite chapters in this course. It's got a lot of really interesting content. Unfortunately, I do have a bit of a cold right now, so I will try to keep the coughing and sniffling to a minimum, and we'll see if we can get through this. So, with respect to what motivation is and what we might think of when we think of the word motivation, we can ask ourselves questions like, what might motivate an athlete to play through the pain and risk permanent injury to help their team win? Or how might we explain the intense romantic bonds between two people that last for decades? So motivation is technically defined as the physiological and psychological processes underlying the initiation of behaviors that direct organisms towards specific goals. So basically it's any kind of goal-directed behavior. So motivation is essential because it contributes to homeostasis. You've probably heard the word homeostasis before. It basically refers to a state of equilibrium within the body. So the body has a bunch of physiological responses that allow it to maintain a consistent internal state in response to our outer environment. So in order to maintain that sense of balance or that sense of homeostasis, we need to basically engage in behaviors that we are motivated to do, such as to eat, to sleep, to have a place, that provides us with shelter. So there are a lot of different types of motivations that we can have. So this is just kind of a little diagram that shows you what we were talking about with maintaining balance. So like I said, homeostasis is kind of that equilibrium or that state of balance. So you could see if these two men are running a marathon, you've got, increased thirst, you might drink water, which increases the water volume within your body, which leads to decreased thirst. But then if you don't drink for a little while, your cellular messages of lowered water concentration are going to be sent to your brain, and it's basically going to cause you increased thirst, and you're going to want to drink water again. So you can see how kind of those motivations to both drink or to kind of decrease drinking over time can help kind of contribute to your body maintaining that sense of equilibrium. So a lot of the earlier research on motivation focused specifically on biological drives. So essentially we're doing the things we do, we're motivated to engage in certain behaviors because they are going to help us kind of survive. So we have biological triggers known as drives that tell us when we may be deprived of something, and they cause us to seek out whatever it is that's needed, whether it's food or water. And then those stimuli that we seek out in order to reduce our drives are known as incentives. So if you look at the way that drives and incentives can influence our behavior, you can see that can kind of come from either side, as in figure 11.2 here. So we might have the drive, that's water deprivation leading to thirst. So again, that's the biological trigger. You don't have enough water, so you get thirsty, and then that motivates you to drink fluids to reduce the drive. On the other hand, you might have something that's kind of an incentive, such as a sweetened sports drink, and wanting to have that taste of that, delicious sports drink can also motivate your behavior, but it would lead to kind of the same behavior. You drink fluids in order to experience the incentive. So no matter what reason you perform the behavior for, you're still basically, you're seeing the same behavior occurring in both cases. There are times, however, when our behaviors cannot be explained by a desire to reach homeostasis alone. So of course we know that we do a lot of the things we do in order to survive and to reproduce and to kind of go on with our lives. But there are times at which there isn't really kind of a strict biological reason for doing the things we do. Sometimes we do things just for the sake of enjoyment. And at times we do stuff because we're stressed. So we could have either internal or external stress, which can motivate us and cause us to use more resources than we normally would. So allostasis is a certain type of motivation that is not only influenced by current needs, but also by the anticipation of future needs caused by stress. So for example, if you're really stressed out and you're studying for a test, and you know that you need a lot of energy to continue studying and to do well on your test, you might actually start snacking heavily. So not only are you kind of fulfilling your current need of kind of having something to munch on, but you're also kind of using it in preparation for a future event that's causing you stress. So in this case, the test. So that was a very brief introduction to what motivation is in general. So now we are going to move on to module 11.1, which is hunger and eating. So we're going to talk about the motives that we have and how they influence our eating behaviors. So years ago, being overweight was actually considered a sign of emotional disturbance. However, at that point, most evidence came from self-reports or very flawed studies. And when you actually saw, research using controlled experiments, there were no significant differences found in terms of kind of emotional disturbance for overweight or normal weight people. It was also found that heaviness is not always caused by overeating. It can actually be as hard for slender people to gain weight as it is for heavier people to lose it. So these findings basically came together to indicate to us that there's some kind of biological mechanism keeping our body weight at what we call a genetically influenced set point. So your set point is kind of the weight you stay at when you're not actively trying to gain or lose weight, and it can vary approximately 10% in either direction. So even though it kind of fluctuates a little bit, most people are going to have that kind of set point, and that's pretty much kind of the range in which their weight is going to stay for pretty much the majority of their life, with the exception of if they're, really trying to lose or trying to gain weight. So everyone has what we call a basal metabolism rate, which is the rate at which the body burns calories for energy, as well as a fixed number of fat cells. So actually everyone has the same number of fat cells. It's how much they expand or shrink that kind of indicates how heavy a person is, how overweight or obese they may appear. And we do see, however, that obese people tend to have about 2 times as many fat cells as the average person. So not only do they have fat cells that are more large, they actually do have kind of a greater amount of fat cells in general. So now we'll talk a bit about the motive for hunger. So the on and off switches for hunger can be found in the hypothalamus, which is a set of nuclei found on the bottom surface of the brain, which are involved in regulating motivation and homeostasis. So the hypothalamus is involved in stimulating the release of a bunch of hormones that can travel throughout your body and have various effects. So stimulating an area of the hypothalamus called the lateral hypothalamus causes eating to begin. And the way I remember this is I think of lateral as kind of like a let's, like L word, so let's eat, while stimulating the ventromedial hypothalamus ceases eating behavior, so it actually causes eating behavior to stop. The activity of the hypothalamus is influenced by hormones, for example glucose, which I'm sure you've all heard of. It's a sugar that serves as the primary energy source for the brain and the rest of the body. And we actually have little things called glucostats. So when glucose is low within our body, these glucostats signal the hypothalamus to trigger eating. Because of course, if it's too low, we need to kind of take in more of that energy. And then insulin, which I'm sure you all heard of, it's something that's talked a lot about in individuals with diabetes, actually helps cells to store glucose for future use. So it actually allows them to kind of store up that energy to be used at a later time. In the past, our ancestors learned to basically eat while they could because they had no guarantee of a next meal. So it wasn't like today where we can go to the grocery store and pick up, a whole cart full of groceries, bring it home, and then always kind of have the guarantee of food to eat in our house. In the past, it was very much, you were hunting. If you had a good day hunting, you had food. If you didn't have a good day hunting, you might have went hungry that day. So what this did is it caused our bodies to develop to like some foods more than others. So for example, we tend to crave fats and fatty foods because we actually have specialized receptors on our tongues. And these receptors send messages to the brain, and they stimulate the release of endorphins and dopamine, which are kind of, dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters heavily implicated in kind of reward systems. And endorphins are kind of those feel-good chemicals in the brain. So basically what happens is if we eat foods that have a high fat content, we tend to feel good. And what that might have been, because based on our evolutionary history, is that obviously if there were days when we were going, for maybe days at a time without food, then it would be more important for us to get kind of the fattiest, kind of most filling food we could when we were able to eat. So we were basically programmed to like those type of foods more. In some situations, high-energy foods can become a more powerful reinforcer than highly addictive drugs. So for example, sugar, you might have heard of people getting like a sugar fix. Sugar and some addictive drugs actually share some interesting similarities. They both stimulate release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, which again is that kind of reward center in the brain. So sugar can actually have similar impacts on the body to some kinds of drugs. Stress can also affect a person's level of ghrelin, which is a hormone in the stomach that stimulates stomach contractions and appetite. So therefore, if you're making more ghrelin, you're going to be more likely to kind of feel hungry or feel like your stomach is kind of grumbling. Based on allostasis, if you predict an upcoming event will be threatening, you will react by stocking up on energy reserves. Because as we mentioned earlier, allostasis is kind of that kind of motivation that relates to preparing for a threat. You're stressed and you're preparing for an upcoming event that might be threatening, so therefore you're going to stock up with as much energy as possible. The reward value of food is also influenced by how much we already have consumed. So for example, eventually we reach what's known as the point of satiation, which is the point in the meal when we're no longer motivated to eat. So once we get to the point where we've had so much food that we feel full, well, obviously that food isn't going to be as reinforcing for us after that point, because we're not going to be kind of craving it as much. And this is caused in part by a chemical called cholecytokinin. Sorry, it's a really difficult one to pronounce, but we just call it CCK, and you don't really need to remember that. It's just kind of one of those chemicals that's kind of included in this process. So with respect to some of the psychological aspects of hunger, so something as simple as even paying attention can have a huge effect on how much we consume. So for example, watching food disappear can serve us as a reminder to stop. So there's been some really interesting studies that have kind of examined this effect. For example, there's one known as the bottomless soup bowl study, and it basically shows us that we're not really great at putting the brakes on when we can't keep track of how much we have consumed. So basically what they did is they actually had a tube that kind of came up to the bottom of the bowl, and the participants were essentially allowed to eat kind of as much as they wanted of this soup, and the ones who had basically the never-ending soup bowl where there was the tube that was coming up and was constantly refilling the bowl as they ate, those participants ate significantly more than people who were allowed to kind of see how much they were eating and kind of see the empty bowl in front of them. So in that case, the empty bowl kind of serves as a trigger that, okay, I've eaten a bunch already, maybe it's time to stop. But in the event that the bowl never goes empty, the person will actually typically eat significantly more. So the results of this study can be explained by something called unit bias, which is the tendency to assume that the unit of sale or portioning is an appropriate amount for us to consume. And in a lot of cases, this does kind of ring true. For example, your textbook mentions bananas. One banana comes in a bananas can, and that's kind of considered a portion that would be, a good size for eating. But unfortunately, the unit bias can also be negative, particularly due to the fact that portion sizes have been increasing substantially over time. So for example, when Coca-Cola was introduced and became a really big thing, it used to be sold in glass bottles that only held about 177 milliliters of fluid. Now if you go to the store, your typical bottle of Coke or typical bottle of Pepsi that you're buying, just for an individual size one, is like 591 milliliters. So it's over tripled what it used to be. And what happens then is, because we assume that, if they're selling it in that quantity as an individual size, then that's how much we should actually be taking in one setting. So over time, as our portion sizes have changed, that unit bias has caused us to kind of eat substantially more and more. And the expansion of portion sizes is something that's being felt worldwide. Some countries are actually even attempting to limit portion sizes and require warning labels to kind of let you know how many calories you're consuming, or the fact that, this particular package contains what should be considered more than one typical serving of whatever product. So now we'll talk a bit about eating in terms of the social context. So in addition to some of the physiological and cognitive influences we just talked about, our food intake can be influenced by social motives as well. So for example, if you're at a party and you're kind of sampling snacks, you might be standing in the corner and not really know anyone there, and so you start munching away at the table of snacks just because you don't really have anything else better to do and you're feeling nervous. Or you might be sitting down with friends out to lunch and you might be gossiping away, and you might end up eating twice the amount that you normally would, just because you're not really kind of paying attention to what's going on. So whether the presence of other people increases or decreases your motive to eat is influenced by the specific social situation as well. So there are 3 general types of processes that can occur, and they can influence your eating behavior in a number of ways. So the first is social facilitation. And social facilitation in general leads to eating more. It occurs when the dinner host encourages guests to take multiple helpings and spend more time at the table. So this is kind of the stereotypical example of going over to, say, a grandparent's house and they just keep kind of feeding you and telling you to have more. That would be kind of an example of social facilitation. Or, if you're at a dinner party with friends, and say one of the members of the couple just loves to cook, and so they're constantly kind of encouraging you to eat more, eat up, then you're more likely to eat more in that situation than you would if you were just sitting at home alone. The second is called impression management, and that one can actually lead to eating less. So in this case, you're wanting the other people that you're with to see you in a certain light, to see you in a certain way. For example, you may be out to eat with some new colleagues or something, and you don't want to appear rude, so you basically eat a small amount of food. And this is what's known as the minimal eating norm. So basically, if you are trying to eat small amounts of food to avoid looking rude or to avoid looking kind of gluttonous, that's kind of known as the minimal eating norm. And then finally we have modeling. So modeling can lead to eating whatever they eat, and they being, whoever you're with in that specific social situation. So either more or less than usual. So, if you go out to eat with a group of friends and you've never really eaten in their presence before, whether, everyone decides, hey, I'm going to get an appetizer and an entree and dessert, or the others all seem like they're just going to have their entree, that might influence you either to eat more or eat less, depending on what kind of the norm of that situation could be. So whenever you're kind of following the cues of whoever you're with in terms of deciding how much you can eat, that would be kind of an example of modeling behavior, how it can influence eating. There are also some environmental influences on weight. And now these aren't actually in the new textbook, but I think they're really interesting because we do know that obesity and being overweight is something that's been on the rise for many years now, and there are a lot of factors that have been influencing this trend. So I just want to take a moment to kind of go through a few of these. So 5 of the major changes in the environment that have been leading culprits in terms of global weight gain seem to be the increased availability of fast or processed foods. So for example, because there have been so many restaurants, fast food restaurants and things popping up all over the world, it basically gives us easier access to those types of foods. And we all know fast food typically tastes good. It's something that you want to have. And if it's more available to you, if there's, say, a McDonald's right down the street from where you go to school, you're more likely to kind of pick up that food rather than going home and cooking a healthy meal. The second is the consumption of soft drinks. And this one is really interesting because although soft drinks are high in calories and sugar, our body doesn't actually compensate for fluid in the same way that it does for solid food. So, when you eat a certain amount of solid food, your body's kind of expecting, okay, you're taking in so many calories, therefore, we've had enough and we may not, we may reach that feeling of satiation pretty quickly. However, our body doesn't actually kind of recognize that, fluids such as soft drinks have so many calories and sugar in them, because typically in our evolutionary history, the things we were drinking didn't really carry a lot of calories and sugars with them. So our body doesn't really know how to compensate for fluid in the same way, even though it may contain way more calories than something that you could be eating, like a solid food. So the third will be a sharp decline in exercise and energy expenditures. So unfortunately, we do see that more and more people are showing a preference for a sedentary lifestyle. A lot of sitting at home, watching Netflix, on the couch, playing video games. There's definitely not as much going on in terms of exercise in a lot of people's lives. That's not to say, there aren't a lot of people who are engaging in physical activity, but in general, overall, our society has become kind of more couch-bound than previous generations, I guess, would report. The fourth is the increased portion sizes for both food and drink. So you've all heard of, supersized meals, say at McDonald's or other fast food places. And we actually even see that babies are being fed about 30% more in terms of their formula than they would have been in the past. So even babies are kind of on the receiving end of larger portion sizes. And then finally, the availability of highly varied foods. And this one is another really interesting one because basically what happens is if you eat the same food over and over and over again, eventually your body kind of starts to become used to it. And consequently, because it's not really that exciting to you and you're starting to kind of get bored of it, you tend to only eat as much as you need in order to feel full. So you don't tend to kind of overeat if you're having that same food for every single meal. And in our evolutionary history, of course, a lot of the time we were eating the same foods over and over. There weren't that many, that large of a variety of foods available for us to kind of just pick and choose from. However, in our current society, there's all kinds of food from all different cultures and all different locations, and we're able to access kind of more things than ever before in our history. And what that leads to is that people tend to not get tired of eating the same foods as easily because they have such a large variety of foods to choose from, and therefore they don't really habituate to them and start to eat less. So we still kind of keep our portion sizes up instead of having them kind of slowly decrease over time. So finally, I want to end this section by talking a bit about some disorders of eating. So I kind of mentioned this in the last slide, but the past few decades have seen a dramatic rise in terms of rates of obesity. So obesity is technically defined as a disorder of positive energy balance in which basically caloric intake exceeds caloric expenditure. So you're taking in more calories than you're letting out or, sweating out. And so in Canada, studies have shown that approximately 60% of males and 45% of females would be categorized as overweight or obese. However, we do see in some individuals hunger-related motivation moves in the opposite direction, which leads them to undereat. And undereating can actually lead to some really negative impacts as well. So the two most common forms of eating disorders are known as anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, both of which can lead to disastrous outcomes over time. So we're going to talk a bit about each. So anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder that involves three main components: self-starvation, so severely restricted food intake, an intense fear of weight gain and dissatisfaction with one's own body, so one's own kind of self-image, and the denial of the serious consequences of severely low weight. Then we have bulimia nervosa, which is characterized by periods of food deprivation. So they do a lot of the time kind of limit the amount of food they eat at some times. Eventually they rebound into what's known as binge eating, and then they end up finding a way to purge that food that they've taken in. So they might use laxatives, they might throw up, they might engage in excessive exercise, but they're finding some way to kind of rid themselves of those calories that they've taken in. It's important to note that with anorexia, there actually is a binge purge subtype of anorexia as well. The main distinction that would kind of distinguish whether or not someone's diagnosed with anorexia versus bulimia is that people who suffer from anorexia actually have a significantly low weight. So there's actually kind of criteria based on BMI, which is the body mass index. You've probably heard of it. It has its own set of issues, but we won't get into those here. But basically, if you are below a certain BMI, then and only then can you meet the criteria for anorexia nervosa. So it doesn't mean that people with anorexia nervosa don't also purge at times, but they do have to meet kind of a bit more stringent criteria than for bulimia. So both of these disorders usually occur during mid to late adolescence and are on the rise. I should say, I guess, beginning in mid to late adolescence. Studies have found that bulimia is linked to impulsiveness, while anorexia is not, and bulimics tend to be more likely overall to enter into treatment programs. So one factor that might contribute to the development of these disorders is stress, and we do see that patients with eating disorders report greater levels of premorbid stress, so premorbid being kind of before the onset of the disorder. Stress can lead to a perceived lack of control, which can then interact with psychological variables such as depression, anxiety, and perfectionism. So typically in terms of people who suffer from kind of a diagnosable eating disorder, there is a large degree of comorbidity in terms of people suffering from multiple different types of disorders as well, such as mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and the like. Social factors can also definitely contribute to the onset of eating disorders. Peer influence is often viewed as the #1 cause of these conditions, and there are actually things such as pro-anorexia websites that will kind of help you to become and encourage you to become and maintain anorexia, which is really awful, but unfortunately these things do exist, and we do know how great of an influence peers are in terms of adolescent development. Families are also often a major influence, so many can actually praise their children with anorexia for being slim and having self-control, not knowing that what they're actually reinforcing is an eating disorder and is very unhealthy. And bulimic patients report that their families were competitive, prone to jealousy, and intrusive. So a lot of the time, what it seems like with eating disorders is that people who develop eating disorders do so as a way to try to kind of exhibit control over their lives. So a lot of the time if people have lives where, their parents are really controlling and domineering and intrusive, and they want to have something that they can focus on and they can have within their control, eating disorders develop kind of as a means of giving the person something that's strictly under their control and something that they can kind of decide, when to eat and how much to eat and that type of thing. We do see that males are less prone to these disorders in general, but unfortunately they can still be susceptible at times as well. And so here's just a table that kind of shows some of the statistical characteristics of eating disorders in Canadians. So we do see the lifetime prevalence of anorexia is about 0.9 for women, 0.3 for men, so about 3 times as many females as males. Same thing with bulimia, 1.5 for women and 0.5 for men, so again 3 times as many. And if we look at percentage of people who are receiving treatment, it's actually a fairly low percentage of people with anorexia who are receiving treatment, only 34%. And the percentage for bulimia is not that much higher at 43%. We do say that anorexia kind of tends to last a little bit shorter period of time in terms of its overall duration, but it is important to also acknowledge that anorexia is by far one of the deadliest mental illnesses, and that's mostly due to the fact that people who suffer from anorexia truly believe that they are overweight. They have such a warped kind of self-image that they truly believe that they are much heavier than they are, and it's very hard to kind of rid them of that type of thinking because they just don't believe the people around them. So unfortunately, eating disorders, particularly anorexia, are some of the mental disorders with the highest rates of mortality and the lowest rates of kind of total recovery. So sorry to end this module on such a kind of negative note, but it is important to keep these things in mind because they are kind of can be really detrimental to people and their families, and it's important that we kind of educate ourselves on them to try to notice the warning signs and help prevent them wherever we can. So finally, I want to talk very briefly about the effect of media depictions of beauty on body image. So one concern regarding eating disorders is the role that culture and the media play in their onset. And your text does discuss this a little bit by using that scientific literacy model that they like to kind of go to. So today, we see that A-list actresses, so the ones who are kind of in the spotlight, they're pressured to have body shapes that are virtually impossible to attain. If you look at what we're expecting of these women and then you look at the average kind of body type, they're not even close to each other. And we do also see that people who are kind of shoved away into worst dress sections in magazines and things like that frequently use weight-related words when discussing why a fashion choice is considered a fail. So a lot of the time, even if it's not directly commenting on the weight, it's still a very kind of present factor, and it's something that carries a lot of stigma. Science has shown that increased exposure to the media is related to decreased satisfaction with one's own body, which probably comes not as a surprise. And individuals with anorexia show increased activity in the amygdala when they are shown negative words related to the body. So they seem to have kind of an increased reactivity in terms of increased sensitivity in terms of things that are related to kind of negative body image. Understanding the relationship between the media and eating disorders can allow for the development of programs to help image-conscious individuals. So it is really important that we keep an eye on these things and that we try our best to ensure that we're watching for warning signs and we're able to kind of develop programs and different educational things to help people understand the severity of these illnesses and hopefully not kind of fall prey to the pressure of the media and society. And that is it for Module 1 on eating behavior. So up next we are going to talk about motives for sex. And then we're going to get into some achievement motivation and some motives for kind of social motivations, love and belonging. And then we will finish with a discussion of emotion. So hopefully you enjoyed this module, and I will talk to you in the second one.